A death in London, January 28, 1943. King's Cross, London. The body was discovered in a warehouse near King's Cross Station at 3:17 a.m. by a night watchman making his rounds. A man, approximately 34 years old, lying on his side near a stack of crates. No identification, no belongings beyond the ragged clothes he wore. He had been dead for several hours. The coroner's report would later describe him clinically. A lunatic who has taken his own life by ingesting rat poison containing phosphorus. Whether it was suicide or desperation, a homeless man so hungry he ate poisoned bread left out to kill rats would never be known for certain. What mattered was that he was dead, unclaimed, and forgotten almost immediately. His name was Glinder Michael. He was 34 years old. He'd fled Wales during the Great Depression of the 1930s after his father committed suicide when the coal mines collapsed. He'd come to London looking for work and found only poverty. By 1943, he was living on the streets, sleeping in warehouses, eating whatever he could find. The body was tagged, photographed, and moved to the Hackney mortuary, where it joined dozens of other unclaimed bodies from London's streets. In a city where German bombs killed hundreds every night, where anti-aircraft guns thundered overhead, where families lost homes and loved ones to fire and rubble. One more death, one more anonymous vagrant, barely registered as a blip in the bureaucratic machinery of wartime London. But Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montague and Flight Lieutenant Charles Cholmondeley of British intelligence were about to give Glinder Michael something he'd never had in life: a purpose. And in doing so, they would transform him into the man who altered the course of the war. The problem Churchill couldn't solve. December 1942, 2 months before Glinder Michael's death. In a smoke-filled conference room beneath Whitehall, Winston Churchill sat at the head of a long oak table, surrounded by generals and admirals. The Prime Minister was frustrated. Not angry, that would come later, but frustrated by the obvious. "Everyone but a bloody fool would know that it's Sicily," Churchill said flatly, tapping his cigar on the ashtray. He was right. The logic was inescapable. By late 1942, with the Allies' success in North Africa, the next move was obvious. Sicily controlled the Mediterranean shipping routes. It was the gateway to Italy. It was close enough to Allied bases in North Africa that air support would be continuous and overwhelming. It was, by every measure, the softest target in southern Europe, which meant the Germans also knew it was Sicily. In the war rooms of Berlin, in the intelligence briefings for Army Group B, in the strategic assessments passed between Hitler's generals, the conclusion was identical. Sicily was the target. But Churchill needed it to not be the target, not just strategically, but psychologically. The Nazis had become experts at defensive preparation. They would fortify Sicily's coast with mines, anti-tank obstacles, and thousands of troops. If the Allies invaded Sicily, they would face a bloodbath. The casualty estimates were staggering. Potentially 30,000 Allied soldiers dead in the first 2 weeks alone. Churchill wanted Sicily, but he needed the Germans to think the Allies were going somewhere else. He needed them to move their troops, their supplies, their defensive preparations away from the island that mattered. How do you convince your enemy of a lie when the truth is obvious to every military mind on earth? The answer was theater. Deception. Lies so elaborate, so detailed, so grounded in seemingly authentic evidence that the enemy would doubt his own intelligence. The problem landed on the desk of the 20 Committee, a secret British intelligence unit responsible for running double agents and deception operations. Their mandate was clear: convince the Germans that the Allies were planning an invasion of Greece and Sardinia, with Sicily as merely a diversionary feint. Finding the right dead man. The solution came from an unlikely source. A 1939 memo written by Ian Fleming, the naval intelligence officer who would later create James Bond, proposed a series of unconventional intelligence operations. Item 28 read, "A corpse dressed as an airman with dispatches in his pockets could be dropped on the coast, supposedly from a parachute that has failed. The enemy, finding the dispatches, would believe them genuine. It was a mad idea. It relied on theater, timing, and the willingness to use a dead man's body as a prop in military deception. Ewan Montague and Charles Cholmondeley decided it was brilliant. But not just any body would work. The deception required a corpse that could pass as someone who died at sea after a plane crash. Rigorous specifications. Male, age 30-40, young enough to be an active duty officer, old enough to hold rank, reasonably healthy appearance, no obvious diseases or deformities. Unclaimed, no family searching for him, no relatives who would ask questions and expose the deception died recently. Decomposition rates had to be predictable for preservation, cause of death that wouldn't contradict the cover story. Nothing that would be detected after weeks in seawater. On January 28, 1943, Sir Bentley Purchas, the coroner for St. Pancras District in London, contacted Montague. He had found a suitable body. Glyndwr Michael. The body met every requirement. Michael had died from rat poison containing phosphorus, a substance that would be difficult to trace after prolonged exposure to salt water. He had no known relatives, no one searching for him. He was approximately the right age and build. His death could pass as accidental during a military operation. Purchas asked Montague the question that would haunt the operation's ethical legacy. Will his family know what happened to him? Montague's answer was blunt. He has no family, and this is war. But even in that dismissive response, there was an unspoken recognition of the line they were crossing. They were taking a forgotten man and making him useful, not by honoring his memory, but by erasing his identity and replacing it with a fiction. On February 4, 1943, Glyndwr Michael's body was transferred from Hackney Mortuary to a refrigerated storage facility controlled by MI5. Officially, the file read, "Unidentified vagrant, pending disposal." Unofficially, he was now Operation Mincemeat's primary asset. The transformation could begin. Creating Captain William Martin Ewan Montague and Charles Cholmondeley understood something fundamental about deception. Details matter more than the lie itself. A forged identity backed by a few fake documents would be spotted immediately by German intelligence officers who spent their lives looking for exactly such things. But a lived identity, supported by correspondence from family, personal mementos, theater tickets, love letters, bank receipts, club memberships, that was something different. That felt authentic. That told a story. Over the next 2 months, they created Captain, Acting Major, William Martin of the Royal Marines. The name was deliberate. Martin was common in the Royal Marines, making him difficult to trace. The rank, Captain acting as Major, was high enough to carry classified documents, but not so senior that German intelligence would have heard of him directly. They gave him a backstory. Born 1907, Cardiff, Wales education, secondary school, no university. Military service, joined Royal Marines 1940, promoted to Captain 1942. Assignment, attached to Combined Operations Headquarters, a real unit, courier for classified documents. But the genius of Operation Mincemeat wasn't in the official records. It was in the personal artifacts, the small, intimate details that made a fake man feel real. A love letter from a fictional fiancée named Pam, written on perfumed stationery, the scent carefully selected from a shop in London. The letter mentioned wedding plans, theater tickets booked for When You're Back, and intimate details that made the relationship feel lived in and genuine. The handwriting was provided by an MI5 secretary who was told only that she was helping with a deception operation. Theater ticket stubs for a London show dated April 22nd, 4 days before William Martin supposedly boarded the plane that would crash. The tickets were deliberately creased and worn, handled as if actually used, the edges slightly bent as real tickets become when sat upon. A receipt from a jeweler for an engagement ring dated April 19th. Expensive, prominent, the kind of purchase a young officer would make before asking a girl to marry him. A stern letter from Lloyd's Bank regarding an $79 overdraft, deliberately included to make Martin seem financially irresponsible, which would explain why he might carelessly allow classified documents to be lost on a risky flight. The letter was written in the precise language of bank correspondence with proper letterhead and account numbers. 2 personal letters from his fictional father, one discussing family matters, another gently chiding William for his reckless spending, his endless extravagances, his tendency not to think before acting. These letters humanized him. They made him a son, not just an officer. A photograph of Pam, actually an MI5 clerk who was told the photo would be used for training purposes. She had no idea her image was being used to create a phantom romance. Personal effects, identity card, military ID, club membership card for a London military officers club, verified as real so German agents could check it, personal receipts, even a stub from a cinema in the West End. The centerpiece was the briefcase, handcuffed to Martin's wrist, containing the fake intelligence, 2 letters from senior British generals. The letters were written in the precise military language of classified correspondence. They discussed an upcoming invasion of Greece and Sardinia, with Sicily mentioned only as a diversionary target to draw German reserves away from the real invasion points. Every item was handled, aged, worn to look authentic. Montague and Cholmondeley spent hours making sure the theater tickets were creased in the right places, folded and unfolded, as if read and reread. The photograph was deliberately worn at the edges, as if carried in a pocket for months. The love letters were arranged as if the young officer had read them many times, the folds becoming soft from repeated handling. They were creating not just a fake officer, they were creating a dead man with a life, a complete fiction so detailed that even a skeptical enemy would struggle to call it false. The body in the refrigerator. While Montague and Cholmondeley crafted William Martin's identity, Glyndwr Michael's body remained in cold storage at a temperature just above freezing. Every few days, Purchase would inspect it, checking decomposition rates and ensuring the corpse would still be viable, still look like a man who'd recently crashed into the sea, when the operation finally launched. The ethical questions were never formally discussed in official channels. There's no record of a meeting where the officers debated whether using an unclaimed homeless man's corpse for military deception was acceptable. The war demanded pragmatism. Glyndwr Michael was dead. His body could be instrumental in saving thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of Allied lives. But some of the MI5 staff involved acknowledged discomfort. One clerk who helped prepare the fake documents decades later recalled in an interview, "We were dressing a dead man in lies. It felt profoundly wrong, even though intellectually we understood the necessity." You don't often think about the ethics of war until you're actually participating in the unethical part of it. Another officer noted, "There was something deeply unsettling about handling a corpse, not as a body to be honored or mourned, but as a tool to be deployed. It crossed a line that I wasn't sure existed until we crossed it. Yet no one refused. No one walked away." The operation continued. By late March 1943, William Martin was ready. Glyndwr Michael's body had been dressed in a pristine Royal Marines uniform, complete with proper insignia and rank markers. Every button polished, every crease pressed. The personal effects were placed in his pockets, the letters, the photographs, the theater tickets, the identity papers, the love note promising marriage, the financial worries, the evidence of a life. The briefcase was handcuffed to his wrist, a permanent attachment. Even in death, William Martin would never be separated from his classified documents. On April 17, 1943, the body was packed in dry ice in a specially designed canister labeled "Optical Instruments" to prevent curious questions, and transported by car to Scotland. On April 19th, the canister was loaded onto HMS Seraph, a British submarine commanded by Lieutenant Norman Jewell. The submarine's crew was told only that they were transporting a body for a special operation and were ordered not to ask questions. No additional explanation was offered. HMS Seraph left Scotland on April 19th and spent the next 10 days crossing the Mediterranean toward the southern coast of Spain. The body remained in its canister, preserved by dry ice, waiting. Glyndwr Michael, now William Martin, was about to embark on his final journey, the only journey in his life that would matter. The coast of Spain, April 30th, 1943, 4:30 a.m., off the coast of Huelva, Spain. HMS Seraph surfaced in darkness approximately 1 mile from the Spanish coast. Spain was officially neutral, but British intelligence knew that Spanish authorities routinely shared information with German intelligence. A military body discovered off the Spanish coast would be reported to Berlin within hours. The submarine's deck crew brought the canister topside. In the pre-dawn darkness, with only red lighting to preserve night vision, they opened the canister and removed the body. The air was salt-filled, cold, carrying the weight of what was about to happen. Lieutenant Jewell later described the moment in a classified report that wouldn't be declassified for decades. The body was stiff with cold and dressed in full uniform. There was something deeply unsettling about it. Not horror exactly, but a profound sense that we were participating in something that blurred the lines between respect and desecration. This was not a burial at sea. This was not a funeral. This was something else entirely. We were disposing of evidence. We were launching a deception. We were using the dead as a weapon. The body was carefully positioned. The briefcase was checked one final time to ensure it remained securely handcuffed to the wrist. Personal effects were confirmed to be in the pockets. A Royal Marines life vest was placed on the body, deliberately inflated to ensure it would float and be discovered quickly. The goal was discovery. Without discovery, the deception would fail. At 4:47 a.m., the body of William Martin was slipped into the Mediterranean Sea. Jewell gave a brief salute. Some of the crew followed. Then the submarine dove. By 5 a.m., HMS Seraph was gone, leaving behind a body floating in the dark water toward the Spanish shore. At 9:30 a.m., a Spanish sardine fisherman named José Antonio Rey Maria spotted something floating in the water near Punta Umbria. He rowed closer and saw a man in a British uniform, face down in the water, a briefcase chained to his wrist. He pulled the body into his boat and rowed to shore, where he immediately reported it to local Spanish authorities. By late morning, the Spanish authorities had notified their German liaisons that a dead British officer carrying classified documents had washed ashore on the Spanish coast. Within 4 hours, German intelligence in Madrid had the briefcase. Within 24 hours, the fake documents were being analyzed by German High Command. Operation Mincemeat had begun. And Glyndwr Michael, the forgotten man from Wales, had finally become significant. The briefcase arrives in Madrid, May 1st, 1943. 10:30 a.m. Madrid, Spain. The Spanish authorities had followed protocol. A dead British officer, washed ashore carrying classified documents. This was precisely the kind of intelligence coup that needed to be shared with their German allies. Within hours of the body's discovery, the briefcase was in the hands of Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, one of the most senior Abwehr agents operating in Spain. Kuhlenthal was 58 years old, methodical, experienced. He'd been running German intelligence operations in Spain for years. He understood the value of what he held, a physical object, a briefcase sealed with wax, containing papers still damp from seawater. The papers were undamaged. The briefcase's lock was intact. Everything about it suggested authenticity. But Kuhlenthal also understood something else. He was looking at something too perfect. In intelligence work, perfection is suspicious. Real documents are crumpled, coffee-stained, hastily written. The papers in front of him were clean, clearly typed, written in perfect military language. The handwriting was precise. The seals were intact. Everything looked official. and yet it was floating in the Mediterranean. Kuhlenthal made a decision. This was too important to process through normal channels. This needed the opinion of the highest authority in German intelligence, Admiral Wilhelm Franz Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, the man who answered directly to Hitler himself. He sent an urgent telegram to Berlin. The man who knew too much. Admiral Wilhelm Franz Canaris was one of the most complex figures in Nazi Germany. He was 56 years old, calm, intelligent, possessed of an almost theatrical manner that masked something far more calculating beneath. To the outside world, he was Hitler's spy master, the man responsible for German intelligence operations across occupied Europe. But to those who knew him well, Canaris was something else entirely. A man slowly, deliberately, working to undermine the Nazi regime from within. The transformation hadn't been sudden. In 1941, Canaris had received intelligence reports of German atrocities in occupied territories, systematic killings, mass executions, the machinery of genocide being assembled. For a man of his background, educated in the old Prussian military tradition where honor and duty meant something sacred, these reports had shattered whatever remaining faith he possessed in the Nazi cause. By 1943, he was no longer just the Abwehr's figurehead. He was the regime's saboteur, sending intelligence to the Allies through intermediaries in Spain and Switzerland, smuggling Jews out of occupied territories, providing information to resistance groups, organizing officers who questioned Nazi authority, all while maintaining his position at the highest levels of Nazi military intelligence. He was, in essence, a double agent operating from inside the Nazi regime itself. But Hitler didn't know it. Yet. When Kuhlenthal's telegram arrived about the briefcase found on the Spanish coast, Canaris saw an opportunity. Not to fall for the deception, that was almost irrelevant. What mattered was that the briefcase had documents inside. Documents that Canaris could read, understand, and then subtly manipulate as they moved through the chain of command to Hitler. Canaris called Kuhlenthal directly. "I want those documents extracted carefully," he said. "Not damaged. I need to examine them personally." The Spanish, working on German orders, used an ingenious method. They wound the still damp papers tightly around a probe and carefully extracted them through the gap between the envelope flap and the body, all without breaking the wax seal. To anyone examining the briefcase later, it would appear completely unopened, completely authentic. Within 48 hours, Canaris had copies of the documents in his hands in Berlin. He read them carefully, slowly, more than once. The papers described an imminent Allied invasion of Greece and Sardinia. Sicily was mentioned only as a diversionary feint, a fake invasion designed to mislead German high command about where the real invasion was coming. The documents included correspondence between British generals discussing troop movements, landing sites, and supply lines, all pointing toward Greece. Canaris understood immediately what he was holding. Either this was absolutely genuine intelligence about Allied invasion plans, or it was an extraordinarily elaborate deception. The question was, which? The moment of doubt. For the next 3 days, Canaris sat with the documents. He analyzed them with the precision of a man who'd spent decades in intelligence work. Evidence? It was real. The papers were damp but undamaged, consistent with a plane crash at sea. The briefcase was sealed with wax, suggesting it had been sealed before entering the water. The documents were written in proper military language, exactly how a British officer would write. They contained specific operational details, divisional numbers, supply ship names, exact dates. The contents were classified, marked as restricted distribution. The very audacity of carrying such documents suggested they were real. Who would risk such intelligence to a deception? Evidence it was false. The papers were too clean, suspiciously unmarked. The documents were too perfectly organized, as if designed for clarity. The entire scenario was too convenient. A plane crashes, a briefcase washes ashore, exactly where Spanish authorities will find it. The level of detail was almost exhaustive, as if designed to convince through sheer volume of specifics, a British officer carrying such sensitive documents would be more careful. Would he really allow them to be exposed to seawater? The perfection was the problem. In war, intelligence is messy. This was too clean. Canaris was faced with the fundamental paradox of intelligence work. How do you distinguish between a brilliant deception and actual intelligence? The answer was that you rarely could with certainty. But Canaris made a decision, and that decision was based not on analysis of the documents themselves, but on something far more subtle. What did Hitler want to believe? Canaris knew the Führer well. He knew that Hitler had been increasingly paranoid about Greece. He knew that German generals in the Mediterranean had been expressing genuine concern about a possible Greek invasion. He knew that there was a vocal faction within German high command that believed Greece was strategically more important than Sicily, more valuable for controlling the Balkans, more useful as a defensive position. Hitler didn't just fear a Greek invasion. He wanted to believe it was coming because that fear validated his strategic instincts about Greece's importance. In other words, Canaris knew that the deception was designed to appeal to Hitler's existing fears and prejudices. And so Canaris made the choice that would alter the course of the war. He would present the documents to Hitler as authentic intelligence, not because he necessarily believed they were authentic, but because he knew Hitler would want to believe they were authentic, and that wanting to believe something often overrides the capacity to think critically about whether it's actually true. Canaris understood power in a way that most people never could. The most powerful people on Earth are often the easiest to deceive because they've created systems that prevent them from hearing doubts. The persuasion. On May 12, 1943, Canaris presented the documents to Adolf Hitler in person. Present at the meeting were Hitler's senior military advisors, including Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the German High Command. Canaris was careful in his presentation. He didn't overstate the certainty of the documents. He presented them as highly credible intelligence from reliable sources. He noted that they had come through multiple verification channels. He emphasized that they came from a dead officer, someone who couldn't be a plant because he was now a corpse. He let the documents speak for themselves. Hitler read them carefully. His face showed little emotion, but Canaris had served the Führer long enough to recognize the signs. Hitler believed them, or more precisely, Hitler wanted to believe them. Greece, Hitler said finally. They're going for Greece. The reports from our agents in Cairo were correct. He turned to Keitel. Begin transferring reinforcements to Greece immediately. I want defensive positions established around Crete and the mainland invasion points. The Allies will not find Greece unprepared. Over the next several weeks, acting on the intelligence provided by the dead man in the briefcase, Hitler made a series of strategic decisions that would reshape the war. The 1st Panzer Division, one of Germany's most battle-hardened units, was transferred from France to Greece. Crack Panzer Grenadier regiments were diverted from Sicily to Greek defensive positions. Supply ships were rerouted to support Greek defenses. Luftwaffe squadrons were reassigned to Greek airfields. German commanders in Sicily were told to expect secondary attacks, not the primary invasion. Wehrmacht strength in Sicily was reduced to skeleton crews of garrison troops. The Germans estimated that they were preparing to defend against 50,000 Allied troops in Greece. In reality, the Allies had no intention of invading Greece at all. The deception had worked so completely that Hitler was now preparing to defend against an invasion that would never happen, while leaving his actual strategic position in Sicily dangerously undermanned. Canaris's hidden calculation, but what Canaris didn't tell Hitler, what he couldn't tell Hitler, was that he knew the deception was working precisely because he had inside intelligence channels to the Allies, through intermediaries in Spain and Switzerland, Through his clandestine network of anti-Nazi officers, Canaris received confirmation that Operation Mincemeat had succeeded. British intelligence contacts let him know in carefully coded messages that the Allies were indeed planning to invade Sicily, not Greece. Canaris was now in an extraordinary position. He was receiving confirmation of what was false from the Allies, and he was using that knowledge to manipulate his own leader into making strategic errors. When Hitler gave the order to move the 1st Panzer Division to Greece, Canaris received confirmation through his clandestine channels that the Allies would indeed be invading Sicily. He said nothing. He presented no contradictory evidence. He allowed Hitler to proceed with strategic decisions based on false intelligence. Why? Because Canaris understood something that most military officers couldn't quite articulate. Sometimes the best way to defeat your enemy is to let your own leaders make catastrophic mistakes. For Canaris, saving lives meant accepting treason. It meant betraying his nation in order to serve something he believed was greater than nationalism: humanity. The war was lost anyway. Germany couldn't defeat the Allies. The question was not whether Germany would lose, but how many people would die before that loss became inevitable. By ensuring that Operation Mincemeat succeeded, by allowing Hitler to move forces away from Sicily, Canaris had reduced casualties on both sides. German soldiers would suffer fewer losses in Sicily because they faced less prepared opposition. Allied soldiers would suffer fewer losses because they encountered reduced German resistance. He had committed an act of high treason in order to save lives. The officer who doubted, but not everyone in German high command accepted the intelligence uncritically. General Albert Kesselring, the commander of German forces in Sicily and Italy, read the intercepted documents and something didn't sit right with him. Kesselring was 58 years old, experienced in both strategy and military deception operations. When he read the briefcase documents, his reaction was immediate and visceral. This is too perfect. This feels orchestrated. The timing is wrong, Kesselring told his staff. Why would British High Command send someone carrying this much detailed intelligence on a single flight? Why risk all of it on one courier? And why would those documents survive so perfectly after being in the sea? Kesselring was not a fool. He'd spent decades in military operations and understood the pragmatism of warfare. But he also understood something else. Strategic deception often works by appealing to what your enemy already believes. He requested a direct audience with Hitler to express his concerns about the authenticity of the documents. He arrived at the Führer's quarters with charts, evidence, and a carefully constructed argument about why the intelligence felt false. Hitler listened politely for 15 minutes, then dismissed Kesselring's concerns. "The intelligence is solid," Hitler said finally, with the finality that brooked no further discussion. "Canaris has confirmed it multiple times. Greece will hold. Sicily will hold. The real invasion is coming to Greece. That is my decision." Kesselring returned to Sicily with orders to strengthen Greek defenses while maintaining Sicily as a secondary holding position. He knew something was wrong, but he had no way to override Hitler's decision. He could only prepare for the worst and hope his reservations proved unfounded. They wouldn't. The strategic collapse, July 10, 1943. 4 a.m. Allied forces began their invasion of Sicily. Operation Mincemeat had worked almost perfectly. German forces in Sicily were below strength because critical units had been diverted to Greece. German commanders in Sicily had been told to expect secondary attacks, not the primary invasion. German reserves were scattered, unprepared, caught by surprise. The invasion succeeded far more easily than Allied planners had dared hope. The beaches that had been assigned the 1st Panzer Division, one of Germany's best-equipped, most mobile units, now faced only garrison troops and hastily assembled reserves. The airfields that should have been defended by Luftwaffe squadrons were instead held by skeleton crews. The defensive positions that Kesselring had been promised wouldn't materialize because the troops assigned to them were thousands of kilometers away in Greece, preparing for an invasion that would never come. Without the 1st Panzer Division and without air superiority, Sicily couldn't hold. German forces retreated across the Strait of Messina into Italy. The invasion succeeded. Sicily was secured. Casualty rates were well below the predicted 30,000 Allied casualties in the first 2 weeks. The actual number was approximately 3,000. Operation Mincemeat had saved approximately 27,000 Allied lives. In Berlin, Hitler finally understood that he'd been deceived. Canaris presented alternative explanations. Perhaps German intelligence in Sicily had been wrong. Perhaps the Allies had changed their plans at the last moment. Perhaps the Italians had failed to hold their positions. But Hitler knew the truth. He'd been fooled, and he began to lose faith in his intelligence services. More significantly, he began to lose faith in Canaris. The weight of knowing. For Admiral Canaris, the success of Operation Mincemeat created an extraordinary moral paradox. He had deliberately allowed his own government to make catastrophic strategic errors. He had withheld information that could have prevented the loss of Sicily. He had used his position at the highest levels of Nazi command to sabotage German military operations. By any measure, this was an act of high treason. But from another perspective, it was an act of humanity rooted in a stark calculation. Canaris understood what Hitler would not accept. The war was lost. Germany could not defeat the Allies. The German military was stretched thin across 3 continents, fighting on multiple fronts with insufficient resources. The industrial capacity of the United States alone was greater than all German production combined. The question was not whether Germany would lose. The question was how many people, German, Allied, and civilian, would die before that loss became inevitable. By ensuring that Operation Mincemeat succeeded, by allowing Hitler to make strategic errors that reduced German defensive capability in Sicily, Canaris had made a calculation. 27,000 Allied soldiers would live instead of die. Thousands of German soldiers would suffer fewer casualties. Tens of thousands of Italian civilians would be spared the devastation that would have come with a longer, more brutal campaign. He had sacrificed his nation's strategic position to save lives. Kesselring never knew that Canaris had deliberately allowed the deception to succeed. To Kesselring, Operation Mincemeat was a German intelligence failure, one that he'd warned about but was ignored. He would spend the rest of the war wondering if those doubts, expressed earlier and more forcefully, might have changed the outcome. He would never know that the outcome had been changed deliberately, from within German high command, by a man who had concluded that the only way to serve Germany was to betray it. The reckoning Canaris's activities as an anti-Nazi agent would eventually be discovered. By April 1945, as Germany collapsed and the entire security apparatus unraveled, Canaris's clandestine intelligence activities and his involvement with resistance groups came to light. Interrogation revealed his communications with Allied intelligence services, his protection of fugitives, his efforts to undermine the regime. Hitler ordered his arrest immediately. On April 9, 1945, just days before the war ended, Canaris was executed by hanging at Flossenbürg concentration camp. He was 56 years old. He would spend his final months knowing that his actions had helped defeat the regime he'd appeared to serve. But he would also die without knowing the full extent of what Operation Mincemeat had accomplished. The complete success of the deception, the exact impact on German strategic positioning, the lives saved, much of this remained classified until decades after the war. He died knowing only that he had chosen to act against his government. Whether his actions had mattered, whether they had truly saved lives, he could not be certain. That uncertainty would follow him to his execution. The final contradiction. The great irony of Admiral Canaris is that he was executed by the regime he'd tried to stop. He was killed as a traitor not because of Operation Mincemeat, that remained hidden, but because of his resistance activities. and he died not knowing that his single greatest act of sabotage had saved tens of thousands of lives. Karl Erich Kuhlenthal survived the war and spent his remaining years in obscurity, never fully understanding why his intelligence assessment had been so catastrophically wrong. General Kesselring survived the war and would be tried for war crimes, defending himself by pointing to his prescient doubts about the documents. But none of them knew the full story. None of them understood that the deception had worked not through the brilliance of the British forgers or the perfection of their false documents, but through the deliberate choice of a German intelligence officer to let his own government be fooled. In intelligence work, there is no moment of certainty. There is only the decision to act based on incomplete information and then the consequences of that decision. Those consequences ripple outward in ways that no one can fully predict or understand. Glyndwr Michael, the Welsh vagrant whose body had started this chain of events, would never know that his corpse had been instrumental in changing the course of the war. He had lived in obscurity and died in obscurity. That he had become historically significant, that he had changed the fate of thousands, would remain a secret hidden in classified files for decades. But his body, in a way that no living person could have achieved, had altered the course of history. And that history had been shaped not just by British deception, but by German doubt, German sympathy for the enemy, and the terrible choice one officer had made to betray his nation in order to serve humanity. The burial under a false name, May 2, 1943. Huelva, Spain. Nuestra Señora Cemetery. The ceremony was precise and proper. Spanish military officers in pressed uniforms stood at attention beside a coffin draped with the Union Jack. A priest conducted the service in Spanish, his words formal and respectful. Flags flew at half-mast. The soldiers rendered a final salute as the coffin was lowered into Spanish soil. Anyone observing might have believed they were witnessing the respectful burial of a brave British officer. The military honors were genuine. The ceremony was dignified. Everything about it suggested that a soldier, a man who'd served his country, carried classified documents, died on a secret mission, was being given the honor he'd earned. The headstone read, William Martin, born 29 March 1907, died 24 April 1943, beloved son of John Glyndwr Martin and the late Antonia Martin of Cardiff, Wales. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, R.I.P. The Latin phrase, carved into the stone by a Spanish stoneworker who didn't know he was commemorating a fiction, meant, "It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country." But beneath that headstone lay one man's body, buried under another man's name. The parents listed on the stone didn't exist. The brother John Glyndwr Martin was a fiction. The death wasn't noble. It was the end of a forgotten vagrant whose corpse had been conscripted into service. For 55 years, that stone would stand in a Spanish cemetery, presenting a lie as history. The man who never lived in Cardiff, Wales, if there had been anyone to notice, the actual Glyndwr Michael's family was grieving differently, or rather, not grieving at all, because they didn't know he was dead. Michael's mother was already dead, taken years earlier. His father had been dead for longer, dead by his own hand, when the Depression collapsed the coal mines and left him with nothing. The only living relative who might have searched for Glyndwr Michael was his sister. But she knew him as lost rather than dead, another homeless man who disappeared into the chaos of wartime London, swallowed by the city's indifference. Michael had lived in obscurity. He would be buried in obscurity. But he would be buried under a false name, commemorated for a death he didn't die, honored as a man he wasn't. This was the final indignity, to be made significant through the erasure of identity. The man who remembered Ewan Montague survived the war and entered civilian life as if the entire operation had been an interesting project rather than a profound moral transgression. From 1945 to 1973, he served as Judge Advocate of the Fleet, the legal authority overseeing all matters of naval justice. He became a respected figure in the British establishment, educated at Cambridge, connected to banking families. He was Jewish, descended from the Rothschilds on his mother's side, appointed to positions of authority and influence. He was precisely the kind of man whose word would be trusted, whose judgment would be respected. Montague understood something about identity and dignity that most people never question. As a Jew in wartime Britain, he'd lived with the knowledge that identity could be weaponized, that names and origins mattered. He understood that being recognized, being remembered, being given one's own name, these were fundamental human rights. And yet, he had participated in an operation that deliberately erased one man's identity and replaced it with a fiction. In 1953, Montague decided to write about Operation Mincemeat. He spent a long weekend writing down the story, almost as an afterthought, as if the operation itself was the achievement, not the means by which it was accomplished. The book, The Man Who Never Was published in 1953 and became an immediate bestseller. 3 years later, in 1956, the book was adapted into a major British film starring Clifton Webb, Clifton Power. The operation that had been classified became public legend. Operation Mincemeat transformed from military secret into cultural phenomenon. Montague became celebrated. He was honored, appointed a commander of the Order of the British Empire, CBE, for his wartime service. He spent the remaining decades of his life as a respected military historian and legal authority. When he died on July 19, 1985, he died knowing that he was remembered as the architect of one of military history's greatest deceptions. But Montague also died carrying a knowledge he never publicly acknowledged. His entire legacy rested on the appropriated corpse of a forgotten man. The Timeline of Truth, 1943, Glyndwr Michael dies and is buried as William Martin, 1953. Montague publishes The Man Who Never Was. Glyndwr Michael's actual name appears in the book, but it's treated as a historical detail rather than a moral issue. The book celebrates the deception without dwelling on its human cost. 1956. The film adaptation becomes a Hollywood success. Glyndwr Michael, when mentioned at all, is a plot device rather than a human being. 1973. Montague retires from his position as Judge Advocate of the Fleet. He spends his remaining years as a respected historical figure. 1985. Ewan Montague dies at age 89. He has spent 32 years since publication of his book, Living with Public Honor and Private Knowledge of What the Operation Required. 1996. Roger Morgan, a historian working with documents released by the British Public Record Office, discovers the truth buried in declassified files. The body used for Operation Mincemeat had been Glyndwr Michael, a Welsh vagrant who died of rat poison in 1943. The full extent of the appropriation, 53 years after the operation, 11 years after Montague's death, is finally publicly acknowledged. 1998, the British government officially confirms Michael's identity. More significantly, they authorize a modification to the headstone in Huelva, Spain. An additional inscription is added beneath the false name. Glyndwr Michael served as Major William Martin, R.M. For the first time in 55 years, Glyndwr Michael's real name appears on his own grave. But it appears as a secondary notation, a correction appended to the original lie. The false name remains primary on the headstone. The truth is subordinate. The question of dignity. The revelation of Glyndwr Michael's true identity didn't settle any ethical questions. It raised them. Was it ethical to use a man's body without family consent? Montague's original justification had been simple. Michael had no family. There was no one to object, no one to be harmed by the appropriation of his remains. But there's a darker way to read this. Glyndwr Michael was powerless precisely because he was poor and isolated. His lack of family, his lack of anyone who cared, made him available for exploitation. The very conditions that made him expendable in life made him exploitable in death. What happens to dignity when someone has no one to defend it? The homeless man buried under a false identity for 55 years had no one to object, no one to demand his name be used, no one to insist on his humanity. His isolation made the operation possible. Does the massive scale of lives saved, 27,000 Allied soldiers, justify the appropriation of his identity? From a utilitarian perspective, the mathematics is straightforward. One life, already ended, weighed against thousands of lives preserved, equals clear moral permission. But from another perspective, the operation established a precedent. The powerless exist to serve the purposes of the powerful, even in death. The plaque in Wales. In 2000, a plaque was installed on the War Memorial in Aberbargoed, a small town in Wales where Glyndwr Michael's family had roots. The stone carried an inscription in Welsh, Iau dyn na fu erioed, the man who never was. It was an honor that Glyndwr Michael never would have received if he'd lived, a recognition of historical significance he could never have achieved through his own actions or presence, a memorial to a man who'd lived in complete obscurity and was recognized in death only through deception. But the memorial was built on a paradox. Glyndwr Michael was celebrated not for who he was, but for what he could be made to represent. He was honored for being useful, not for being himself. The unresolved questions. Ewan Montague died in 1985, 11 years before the truth about Glyndwr Michael's identity was officially confirmed. He never had to publicly confront the full moral weight of what Operation Mincemeat required. Charles Cholmondeley, the RAF officer who'd conceived the original plan, died before Montague, spending his final decades in near-total obscurity. Unlike Montague, he never gave interviews or wrote books. He lived quietly with the knowledge of what he'd done, never seeking honor or recognition for it. Admiral Canaris had been executed in 1945, dying without knowing the full impact of his role in allowing the deception to succeed. General Albert Kesselring, who doubted the documents and been ignored, survived the war and was tried for war crimes. He would live for decades after the war, always knowing he'd been right to doubt, but always powerless to have changed anything. And Glyndwr Michael remained in a Spanish cemetery, his identity officially unknown for 55 years, then known but secondary, a notation appended to the false name under which his grave proclaimed him William Martin. The ledger of Operation Mincemeat. If you calculate the operation purely as military strategy, the balance sheet is clear. Lives saved. Approximately 27,000 Allied soldiers, casualty estimate reduced from 30,000 to 3,000 in Sicily campaign. Lives used. One vagrant, already dead. Strategic consequence, thousands of German troops diverted to Greece. Sicily secured with minimal resistance. Italy's surrender accelerated. The war shortened by months. Moral consequence. One man's identity appropriated without consent. His remains used as military equipment. His death transformed into a fiction for 55 years. His humanity subordinated to the needs of state power. From a utilitarian perspective, it's a triumph. One life, which had ended anyway, which had been insignificant and unclaimed, was transformed into the mechanism that saved tens of thousands of others. But the equation relies on a troubling assumption. Because Glyndwr Michael had no one, his body belonged to history rather than to himself. Because he was powerless, his appropriation was acceptable. What was owed? In the decades after the war, as Operation Mincemeat became legend, certain obligations went unmet. Michael's sister never knew what happened to her brother. She went to her own grave, never understanding that his corpse had become historically significant. The Welsh community that knew Michael's family history never knew that their son had been conscripted into service in death, his body used without permission, his identity erased for 55 years. History itself was told as a story of British brilliance and German gullibility, with no accounting for the human being whose corpse made the deception possible. Dignity was never restored. Even when Michael's name was finally added to the headstone in 1998, it was added subordinately. The lie remained primary, the truth secondary. The significance of insignificance. The final irony is almost unbearable in its perfection. Glyndwr Michael's only path to historical significance was the complete erasure of his identity. In life, he was significant to almost no one. He lived as a vagrant in London, died alone in a warehouse, was scheduled for cremation in a pauper's grave with no ceremony or remembrance. In death, transformed into a tool of military strategy, he became historically important. His corpse changed the course of wars. His body, used without his consent, saved tens of thousands of lives. His appropriated identity became the subject of best-selling books, major films, academic papers. But he only became significant by ceasing to be himself. The man who was nobody became somebody, but the somebody he became wasn't him. It was Major William Martin, a fiction, a deception, a tool. When his real name was finally added to the headstone 55 years later, the inscription read, "Glyndwr Michael, served as Major William Martin, R.M." Not Glyndwr Michael, who was used as Major William Martin. Not Glyndwr Michael, whose body was appropriated. Just served as if he had chosen this role, consented to this identity, participated willingly in his own historical erasure. The unfinished story. By 2025, more than 80 years after Operation Mincemeat, Glyndwr Michael remains buried in Spain. His grave bears two names, the false identity that was primary for 55 years, and the true identity that was added when the secret was finally revealed. The headstone is a palimpsest, multiple truths written over each other, the original lie still visible beneath the later truth, the lie still taking prominence in the stone's layout and emphasis. No one visits regularly. It's a historical curiosity in a Spanish cemetery, visited occasionally by WWII historians, military strategists, and tourists interested in famous deceptions. But Glyndwr Michael himself, the actual man, the Welsh drifter who lived and died in obscurity, remains largely unknown. The questions that should have haunted everyone involved remain unresolved. Was it ethical? Was it necessary? Would Glyndwr Michael have consented? What is owed to someone whose body was used for historical purposes without permission? Is it acceptable to appropriate the powerless? What does it mean that his only path to significance was through the denial of his own identity? Ewan Montague died celebrated as one of military history's great strategists. Glyndwr Michael remained in history as a plot device, significant because his corpse was useful, remembered because he could be made to represent something greater than himself. One man is remembered for what he accomplished. The other is remembered for what was done to him, and both remain unknown. What deception changed, January 2025. 82 years after Operation Mincemeat. Operation Mincemeat is officially taught in military academies across the world. It appears in War College curricula at West Point, the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence, and the intelligence training facilities of the United States, Britain, Germany, and France. But the lessons taught aren't always the ones the operation intended. In war rooms and strategy sessions, military officers study Operation Mincemeat not to understand the ethical cost of deception, but to understand how to replicate it. They learn the technical specifications, how to construct false identities, how to plant misleading evidence, how to redirect enemy belief through planted information. They learn the mechanics of deception, not its moral weight. The operation showed that deception could work on a strategic level. What it didn't show, what official curricula rarely examine, is the cost. The man whose body was used, the identity that was stolen, the truth that was buried for 55 years. How military strategy changed. Before Operation Mincemeat, deception in warfare was primarily tactical. False troop movements, misleading radio signals, camouflaged supply lines. You misled your enemy about where your forces were, not who they were. Operation Mincemeat changed this fundamental assumption. It demonstrated that you could construct an entire false identity, a complete biographical fiction with supporting documents, personal effects, and emotional details, and use that fiction to redirect enemy strategy at the operational and strategic level. It proved that deception was not just a supporting tactic, it could be the primary strategy. The success was immediate and measurable. Hitler moved the 1st Panzer Division and 90,000 soldiers away from Sicily to defend Greece based entirely on fake documents. The Germans' own decoded intercepts, captured by Bletchley Park's codebreakers, confirmed to British intelligence that Operation Mincemeat had worked. The deception had redirected Hitler's strategic thinking. After the operation's success became known, the principles were applied to subsequent operations. Operation Fortitude, the deception operation supporting the D-Day landings in 1944, used similar techniques: false military units, fabricated radio communications, double agents spreading misleading information. Fortitude convinced the Germans that the primary invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Historians estimate that Operation Fortitude saved tens of thousands of Allied lives by achieving surprise. The direct lineage is clear. Operation Mincemeat proved the principle. Operation Fortitude applied it, and both succeeded. The Cold War inheritance. After World War II, Soviet, American, British, and French intelligence services studied Operation Mincemeat with obsessive intensity. They dissected its techniques. They documented its success. They transformed its principles into doctrine. During the Cold War, both CIA and KGB operations drew directly from Operation Mincemeat's playbook. The principle of using false intelligence to redirect enemy strategy became foundational to intelligence operations. CIA-backed operations in Iran, 1953, used false evidence and planted documents to suggest a Soviet-backed coup, justifying U.S. intervention. Soviet operations in Eastern Europe used similar techniques, fabricating evidence, planting false communications, manipulating how Western intelligence perceived events. Cuban Missile Crisis intelligence assessments relied on distinguishing between real and false intelligence, a lesson Mincemeat had already taught about the difficulty of verification. The deception principles that had worked in 1943 became normalized in intelligence doctrine by the 1950s. They were no longer exceptional. They were routine. The Information Age inheritance. In the 21st century, Operation Mincemeat's legacy has evolved into something significantly more troubling: industrial-scale information warfare. The principle that false information can redirect belief and action, demonstrated through a corpse with a briefcase in 1943, has metastasized into sophisticated disinformation campaigns operated by state actors. Russia's 2016 U.S. election interference. Russian intelligence created thousands of false social media identities, the digital equivalent of Major William Martin. These fake accounts weren't real people, just as William Martin wasn't a real officer. They posted inflammatory content, amplified divisive narratives, and redirected how millions of American voters perceived political reality. The operation used Operation Mincemeat's core principle: plant false information. Let the target's own psychology validate it. Redirect belief and action. Chinese disinformation operations. China's state-sponsored accounts spread false narratives about COVID-19 origins, U.S. military activities, and democratic processes. The technique is identical to Operation Mincemeat. Create false identities, plant misleading evidence, manipulate perception. Iranian propaganda networks. Iran's information warfare operations deploy the same principles: false accounts, planted narratives, redirected belief. The scale of deception. The difference from 1943 is scale. Operation Mincemeat involved one corpse, one briefcase, one set of documents. Modern information warfare involves millions of fake accounts, billions of automated posts, algorithmic amplification that multiplies the reach of false information exponentially. But the fundamental principle is identical. Use false information to redirect enemy or population belief and action. What Ewan Montague never witnessed. Ewan Montague died on July 19, 1985, at age 89. He lived long enough to see the beginning of the computer age, but not long enough to see information warfare. He never witnessed Russian interference in elections. He never saw how the principles he'd established could be deployed against civilian populations. He never saw how the lie carefully crafted to seem true could be scaled from one corpse to billions of digital personas. If Montague could see the present day, the algorithmic amplification of disinformation, the deployment of AI-generated deepfakes, the normalization of information warfare in peacetime, what would he think? Would he defend Operation Mincemeat as justified wartime deception? Or would he recognize that by proving deception could work, by establishing the principle that false information could redirect strategic thinking, he'd created a template that would eventually be weaponized against civilian populations? The question hangs unanswered because Montague never had to face it publicly. From wartime to peacetime, the blurred line. Here's the crucial distinction that Operation Mincemeat failed to make explicit. In wartime, deception is understood as a military tool. You deceive your enemy about military intentions. The stakes are life and death. The costs are measured in casualties. In peacetime, deception becomes manipulation. You deceive citizens about political reality, public health information, historical facts, economic conditions. The stakes are different. The victims are different. The justification becomes murkier. Operation Mincemeat succeeded in wartime because the principle was understood as militarily justified. We need to save lives in Sicily. Deception can achieve that. Therefore, deception is justified. But that principle didn't stay limited to wartime. The intelligence agencies that learned Operation Mincemeat's lessons applied them in peacetime. They deployed false information to manipulate elections, to justify interventions, to redirect public opinion. Once you accept that deception is justified if the outcome is beneficial, there is no stopping principle. The question becomes, who gets to decide what outcome is beneficial? And the answer, historically, has always been the powerful. The cost of the template Operation Mincemeat established a template. It is acceptable to create false identities, plant misleading evidence, and redirect belief if the outcome is strategically beneficial. But that template didn't remain classified. It became doctrine. It spread through military thinking, intelligence thinking, political thinking. It became the operating system of modern information warfare. The cost of establishing this template is that we now live in an information environment where governments routinely deploy disinformation as policy. Citizens can't reliably distinguish between real and false information. Trust in institutions has collapsed because those institutions have normalized deception. The powerless are most vulnerable to information manipulation, just as Glyndor Michael was most vulnerable to bodily appropriation. The war-peace distinction. The real question is whether Operation Mincemeat established a principle that should have remained limited to warfare, or whether the principle is actually universal. In wartime, most ethicists and strategists accept that deception is permissible. The costs of not deceiving, casualties, defeats, are understood as worse than the costs of deceiving. But what if we extended this logic to peacetime? Is it acceptable to spread false information about a political opponent if you believe your side would govern better? Is it acceptable to manipulate stock markets with false information if you believe the market is fundamentally unjust? Is it acceptable to deploy disinformation to achieve public health goals if you believe the population is irrational? Once you accept the Mincemeat principle, that deception is justified if the outcome is beneficial enough, these questions become matters of calculation rather than ethics. And that's where we've ended up. A world where deception is normalized as a tool of statecraft, and the only question is whether the outcome justifies the means. The powerless as material. The deepest continuity between Operation Mincemeat and modern information warfare is this. Both depend on the powerless as raw material. Glyndŵr Michael was used because he was powerless. He had no family to object, no one to protect him, no social standing to resist appropriation. Modern disinformation campaigns similarly target the powerless. They're most effective against populations with limited media literacy, limited access to alternative information sources, limited power to resist manipulation. Marginalized communities, economically disadvantaged populations, elderly people with limited digital literacy. These are the easiest targets. The operation that began by appropriating a poor man's corpse has evolved into a system of appropriating poor people's attention, belief, and votes. What we've built in military academies, Operation Mincemeat, is celebrated as brilliance. Students learn the technique without learning the cost. They learn that deception works, not that deception, once normalized, becomes the operating system of power. We've built an architecture of information control on the foundation of a single principle, that false information can be justified if the outcome is beneficial to the powerful. And we've applied that principle universally. From wartime deception to peacetime manipulation, from enemies to citizens, from the battlefield to the information space. The result is a world where truth is optional, where deception is normalized, where the powerful deploy false information as routine policy. The unexamined legacy. By 2025, we've normalized deception in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1943. Governments deploy disinformation campaigns without controversy. Technology companies amplify false information algorithmically. Political movements are built entirely on false premises that are known to be false by their operators. And it all traces back to a principle established in 1943, that deception is justified if the outcome is good enough. Ewan Montague died without having to explain what he'd created. He was celebrated for his brilliance and his wartime service. He never had to defend the template he'd established or confront the consequences of normalizing deception. But we're living with those consequences. We're trapped in an information environment where deception is normalized, where truth has become optional, where power is exercised primarily through the manipulation of perception. The final grave. In Huelva, Spain, the grave still stands. 2 names on the headstone: William Martin, still primary. Glyndŵr Michael served as Major William Martin, RM. Still secondary. The lie is still more prominent than the truth. The fiction is still more visible than the reality. It's a perfect metaphor for what Operation Mincemeat became. A demonstration that the lie, if believed, becomes more real than the truth. That the fiction, if well crafted, has more power than reality. That false identities, once established, are harder to erase than true identities. Glyndŵr Michael is remembered as the man who never was, which means he's remembered as a fiction, not as a person. His only significance is the deception built on his corpse. His only fame is the lie that replaced his identity. In the end, Operation Mincemeat teaches a lesson very different from the one taught in military academies. It shows that deception works best when directed at those who cannot resist it. That manipulation succeeds most completely when applied to the powerless. That once you accept deception as justified strategy, there is no principle left to stop it from becoming the foundation of how power operates. The operation that was meant to save lives in Sicily became the template for how information warfare operates against civilian populations worldwide. And Glyndŵr Michael, who was appropriated in death after being abandoned in life, became the unwitting founding principle of modern disinformation. That the powerless exist to serve the purposes of the powerful, even if that service consists of nothing more than having your identity stolen and your corpse weaponized. The questions we still haven't answered. Ewan Montague died celebrated, never having to publicly confront these questions. Was Operation Mincemeat justified? Most historians say yes, the lives saved were worth the cost. But what principle did it establish? That deception is justified if the outcome is beneficial enough. That truth is secondary to utility. That the powerless can be used as tools if the powerful benefit. And what happens when that principle is applied universally? We get the information environment we have in 2025, where deception is normalized, where truth is optional, where power is exercised primarily through the manipulation of perception. Could we have established that principle differently? Could we have said, deception is justified in this specific wartime context, but we will not allow this principle to spread to peacetime or to civilian populations? Theoretically, yes, but that's not what happened. The principle spread, it metastasized, it became the foundation of modern statecraft, and we're still living with the consequences.